They thought they were just stealing my company and my husband. They didn't realize that in their greed, they were forging their own executioner. If you want to see how a woman's shattered heart can be rebuilt into a weapon of cold, calculating justice, stick around and see how this story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love to see how far a story can travel. For 15 years, my world was a perfectly engineered masterpiece of glass and steel, much like the sustainable skyscrapers our company, Ethel, designed. I was Ilara Vance, the COO, the silent engine behind the throne. My husband, Julian, was the king, the charismatic CEO whose face graced magazine covers. Our best friend, Chloe, was our fierce head of legal, the keeper of our secrets and my personal confidant. We were the ultimate power trio, a testament to what love, friendship, and shared ambition could build. I never craved the spotlight. I found my satisfaction in the quiet hum of our global empire, in the complex logistics and strategies that I knew were the true foundation of our success. I believed Julian's charm and my intellect were an unbeatable force, built on a bedrock of unwavering trust. I saw him not just as my husband, but as my partner in every sense of the word, and Chloe as the sister I never had. It was a beautiful, flawless illusion. That trust was my life's operating system. It ran in the background of every decision, every late night at the office, every celebratory dinner. I remembered the early days, crammed into a tiny office with leaky pipes, dreaming of the future. It was the three of us against the world. I willingly took a back seat in the public eye because I believed our bond was our greatest asset. I saw Julian's ambition not as a threat, but as the fire that I was happy to fuel with my own quiet brilliance. I managed the billion-dollar contracts, the intricate supply chains, and the thousands of employees, all so he could shine. I thought we were building a legacy together, a dynasty founded on love and mutual respect. I was the architect of our success, but I was content to let him live in the penthouse. After all, I had designed it. My name was on the blueprints of our life, and I was foolish enough to believe that made my position unshakable. On the night of our anniversary, I was about to find out that my signature could be erased. The 15th anniversary, a milestone that deserved more than a simple dinner. I had orchestrated a surprise weekend getaway, every detail perfect, a testament to the way I managed our lives and our company. Julian was supposed to be in a late meeting across town, a perfect excuse for me to pack his bags and whisk him away. But a nagging unease, a flicker of intuition, made me check the location of our shared car. We'd installed the tracker years ago after a minor security incident, a practical measure that had since become a forgotten feature. Now, seeing the car's icon blinking on my screen, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't at his office building. It wasn't even on a logical route home. It was stationary at a place called the Starlight Motel, an establishment whose name was far grander than its seedy, roadside reality. My mind raced to find an explanation. A secret anniversary surprise of his own, perhaps. But the cold dread seeping into my bones knew better. It was a lie I told myself for the 30-minute drive. A fragile shield against a truth I wasn't ready to face. The motel looked even more pathetic in person. A flickering neon sign cast a sickly pink glow over peeling paint, and a parking lot filled with rusted-out vehicles. It was a world away from the gleaming chrome and glass of our life. A sordid little corner of the universe where secrets went to fester. My hands trembled as I parked my own car out of sight. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to drive home and pretend I had seen nothing, to preserve the beautiful illusion I had so carefully constructed. But I was never one to ignore a problem. In our business, you face threats head-on, you gather data, and you act. Walking towards the room number indicated by a discrete app I'd linked to the tracker, I felt less like a wife and more like an auditor about to uncover a catastrophic financial discrepancy. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap disinfectant, a scent that would forever be burned into my memory as the smell of my world ending. I didn't knock. I used the spare key from my purse, the one we kept for emergencies. This, I thought with a grim sense of irony, certainly qualified. The scene that greeted me was a cliché. So painfully predictable it almost felt like a scene from a bad movie. Julian, my husband of 15 years, and Chloe, my best friend since we were teenagers, were tangled in the cheap sheets of the motel bed. The air was stolen from my lungs. It was a physical blow, a visceral impact that made the room tilt on its axis. For a moment, sound and color bled away, leaving only a silent, grayscale tableau of the two people I trusted most in the world. Chloe let out a small, startled gasp, fumbling to pull a sheet over herself, her face a mask of panicked guilt. Julian, however, simply turned his head. There was no shock in his eyes, no shame, no desperate apology forming on his lips. There was only a flash of irritation, a flicker of pure, unadulterated annoyance, as if I were a pesky interruption, a minor inconvenience that had derailed his plans for the evening. That look, more than the infidelity itself, was the first twist of the knife. He sat up, utterly unconcerned with his own state of undress, and his voice, when he spoke, was flat, devoid of any emotion except for a cold, dismissive authority. "Alara," he said, and my name sounded alien coming from him. "You shouldn't be here." The words hung in the stale air. An indictment. I shouldn't be here, in a room with my husband and my best friend. He wasn't saying he was sorry I had found them. He was angry that I had found them. He was treating me like a trespasser in the ruins of my own life. Chloe looked away, unable to meet my eyes, but Julian's gaze was steady, challenging. He was not a man caught in a moment of weakness. He was a man whose carefully laid plans had been inconveniently discovered. The humiliation was a firestorm, but beneath it, a chilling question began to form. This wasn't just a tryst. This was something else. This was organized. My gaze, numb and unfocused, drifted from their faces, scanning the messy room as if searching for an answer, for something that made sense. And then I saw it. On the cluttered nightstand, pushed aside to make room for 2 half-empty water bottles, was a document. It was professionally bound in a dark blue ethyl cover, the familiar silver logo of our company gleaming under the dim lamplight. It looked completely out of place in this sordid setting, a relic from a different universe. My eyes struggled to focus on the title printed in stark, white letters. The Nightingale Protocol, Final Asset Transfer. The words were a foreign language. Protocol? Asset transfer? The affair was a brutal, emotional dagger to the heart. But that document was something far colder, far more terrifying. It was a whisper of a conspiracy so vast and calculated that the betrayal in the bed beside it suddenly felt like a mere footnote, a simple, cruel distraction from the real annihilation that was planned for me. The drive back from the motel was a blur of streetlights and silent, screaming grief. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the scene replayed in my mind on an endless, agonizing loop. The cheap sheets, Chloe's panicked face, Julian's cold irritation. The pain was a physical entity, a shard of ice lodged in my chest, threatening to shatter me with every breath. But as the miles passed, something else began to surface through the storm of emotion. A cold, hard clarity. Julian's words, "You shouldn't be here," echoed not as a clumsy excuse, but as a tactical statement. I wasn't just an inconvenient wife. I was an unforeseen variable in a much larger equation. The affair was the messy, human part of it, but the document, the Nightingale Protocol, that was the real betrayal. That was the blueprint for my annihilation. In that moment, my heartbreak didn't vanish, but it was superseded by a chillingly logical thought. My pain was a liability, but their perception of it could be my greatest asset. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn the car around, to storm back into that room and unleash a hurricane of rage and accusation. I wanted to see them squirm, to force them to confront the wreckage they had made of our lives. But the strategist in me, the COO who had navigated hostile negotiations and corporate espionage for 15 years, took control. A confrontation would achieve nothing. It would only serve my emotions, not my objective. They would lie. They would deny everything about the protocol, bury it so deep I'd never find it, and accelerate their timeline. They would paint me as a hysterical, vengeful wife, and the board would believe them. My only advantage, the only weapon I had left in my arsenal, was that they thought I was a fool. They believed I had only seen a simple, sordid affair. They had no idea I had seen the title of their master plan. My silence was now my shield and my sword. By the time I pulled into our pristine, silent garage, the decision had been made. A new protocol was being written, not on paper, but in the ice forming around my heart. I wouldn't be the avenging fury. I would be the grieving victim. I would play the part they expected me to play, the role they had already cast for me. The next morning, I would confront Julian, but my accusations would be limited to the affair. I would weep. I would be shattered, incoherent with grief, too devastated by personal betrayal to even think about our company. I would let them see me as a broken woman, an emotional casualty they would need to manage. Their arrogance would be their downfall. They would be so busy patting themselves on the back for handling my emotional collapse that they would never see me moving silently through the corporate network, hunting for the truth of their conspiracy. My tears would be my camouflage. I walked into the house, the grand, empty monument to our shared success, and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the foyer window. The woman staring back was a stranger. The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial calm. The trusting wife, the loyal friend, the silent partner. She had died in that motel room. In her place stood a queen whose kingdom had been stolen, a strategist facing the most important campaign of her life. My objective was no longer about saving my marriage or salvaging my pride. It was about total reclamation. I would dissect their Nightingale protocol, expose every lie, and take back not just the company I built, but the very legacy they sought to erase. They thought they were closing a chapter on Alara Vance. They had no idea they had just started her origin story. The game was on, and I was no longer playing for two. I was playing for me. My grief was a fortress. From the outside, it looked like a ruin, impenetrable, desolate, and emotionally overwhelming. Julian and Chloe saw only the crumbling walls of a shattered woman, a sight that fed their arrogance and made them feel secure. But from the inside, my fortress was a command center. Every tear I shed in front of them was a calculated misdirection. Every broken whisper a strategic feint. While they were busy managing my emotional breakdown, I was mapping out my silent war. The first step was to crawl back into the digital heart of the company I built. I didn't need a password. I had designed the system's architecture. I knew its strengths, its hidden back doors, and every single one of its exploitable weaknesses. My pain was their blindfold, and in their darkness, I began to move. My vengeance would not be a loud, messy explosion. It would be a quiet, systematic, and complete system failure. The first strike was aimed at the very foundation of their plan, their financial data. They were relying on Ethel's predictive models to time the stock devaluation perfectly. So, I became a ghost in the machine. I didn't delete anything. That would be too crude, too easily detected. Instead, I introduced chaos theory into their spreadsheets. I wove tiny, almost imperceptible corruptions into the source code of their projection software. A single line in a million that instructed the program to miscalculate a specific variable by 0.05%. It was a digital butterfly wing, a change so minuscule it would pass any diagnostic. But over thousands of iterations, that tiny flaw would compound, causing their confident projections to drift, slowly but surely, into the realm of pure fiction. They were flying a state-of-the-art aircraft, completely unaware that I was the one rewriting the laws of physics around them. I knew my own limitations. I was a strategist, not a deep-dive hacker. To navigate the darkest corners of our servers without leaving a trace, I needed a specialist. My mind immediately went to David Chen, a brilliant but overlooked analyst in our cybersecurity division. I had mentored him 3 years prior, recognizing a fierce intellect hidden behind a quiet demeanor. I approached him not as a vengeful wife, but as the concerned COO. I fabricated a story about a recent security audit that flagged potential and internal data vulnerabilities. I asked him, off the record, to conduct a deep system sweep, to look for anything that seemed out of place. I framed it as a test of his skills, a special project just for him. His eyes lit up. He was eager to prove himself, and fiercely loyal to the woman who had first believed in him. He had no idea he was being recruited as the first soldier in my private army. Working late into the night, communicating through encrypted channels, David became my eyes and ears inside the network. He was the perfect operative. His low-level clearance meant he was invisible to senior management, but his skills allowed him to bypass digital barriers like a phantom. It took him less than 48 hours to find the first breadcrumb, tucked away on a partitioned server, shielded by 3 layers of misdirection, was a ghost project codenamed Nightingale. It had no official budget, no assigned team. Its funding was a spiderweb of microtransactions, pennies siphoned from hundreds of different departmental accounts. It was financial camouflage of the highest order. Seeing the name on my screen was a chilling validation. The document in the motel room was real. This was the blueprint. My heart didn't race. It steadied. Now, I had a name for my enemy. With their financial foundation silently crumbling, I turned my attention to psychological warfare, specifically targeting Julian's greatest weakness, his ego. He needed to be seen as a visionary, a risk-taker. So, I began to subtly nudge him toward self-destruction. One evening, as he lamented the stagnation of the market, I, in my role as the vacant, grieving wife, mumbled something about a rival CEO who had just made headlines with a daring, high-risk corporate acquisition. "He's so bold," I whispered, letting a single tear roll down my cheek. "You were always bolder than him, Julian." The seed was planted. I knew his pride would never allow him to be outshone. I watched as he started pushing for a series of aggressive, over-leveraged investments, decisions that our newly corrupted financial models were now telling him were guaranteed wins. He was steering their getaway car directly toward a cliff I had engineered. For Chloe, the attack had to be more precise. She was the meticulous planner, the keeper of secrets. Her confidence came from control. So, I aimed to destroy that control. Through David, I orchestrated a series of minor but deeply unsettling digital glitches targeted only at her. A critical legal document for the Shell Corporation would be momentarily corrupted, only to fix itself an hour later. Calendar invites for their secret meetings would vanish and then reappear. I even had David insert a single, untraceable pixel onto her desktop that would change color every few hours. These were not direct attacks, but subtle digital hauntings designed to make her feel like she was being watched. I wanted to plant a seed of paranoia in her mind, to make her question the security of every file, every email, every secret she kept. A conspirator who fears they've been compromised becomes a liability. The pressure began to mount. The first visible crack appeared during a preliminary meeting with a potential investor for their hostile takeover. The financial projections Julian presented, based on my corrupted data, were so illogical that the investor openly questioned his competence. Julian was humiliated. He returned home that night in a rage, ranting about the idiots in the analytics department. The next day, Chloe called him, her voice tight with anxiety, complaining that her system was acting erratically. I listened to their strained conversation on a bug I had David plant in Julian's office, a small smile playing on my lips. He blamed his team. She blamed the technology. They never once suspected the broken woman sitting silently in the living room. The first seeds of distrust between them were beginning to sprout. Our next breakthrough came when David finally managed to unspool the complex web of offshore accounts. It was a masterpiece of financial misdirection, designed by Chloe to be untraceable. But she had made one small mistake, reusing a single routing number from a previous, legitimate company acquisition years ago, a detail only I would remember. It was the thread David needed to pull. After days of relentless work, he unraveled it all, leading us to a single entity, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands named Viridian Holdings. We finally had a name for their weapon. It was a tangible piece of their conspiracy, something I could use. The satisfaction was a cold, clean burn. I wasn't just defending anymore. I was building my case against them, brick by irrefutable brick. With the name of the Shell Corporation in hand, it was time to bring in an outside force. I couldn't risk a direct attack, but I could invite a predator into their ecosystem. I composed a carefully worded, anonymous email from a disposable account. It was sent to a mid-level compliance officer at a federal regulatory agency, a man I knew from a charity board to be ambitious and thorough. The email didn't scream conspiracy. It was far more subtle, merely flagging Viridian Holdings for a pattern of unusual capital structuring that might warrant a routine review. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of placing a small rock in their path. It wouldn't stop them, not yet, but it would slow them down, force them to produce paperwork, and wrap them in the one thing they couldn't afford: time-consuming red tape. The performance at home became my second full-time job. Julian's frustration with work bled into our evenings, and I became his silent, hollow-eyed sounding board. He would pace the length of our marble living room, complaining about the unforeseen market volatility and the incompetence that was plaguing his plans. I would sit there, curled up on the sofa in a cashmere blanket, looking fragile and lost. I would nod, offer him a glass of scotch, and murmur empty words of support. All the while, my mind was a whirlwind of activity, cross-referencing his complaints with the sabotage I had initiated that day. He was confessing his failures to the very architect of his ruin, and the dramatic irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost a physical presence in the room. The regulatory inquiry landed exactly as I had hoped. It wasn't a raid, just a formal letter requesting documentation on Viridian Holdings' source of funds. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. Panic erupted between them. In the bugged audio from Julian's office, I heard him explode at Chloe. "This was your department. You told me it was airtight," he yelled. Chloe, already on edge from the digital hauntings, shot back, her voice laced with venom. "Maybe if you hadn't been so aggressive with the transfers, we wouldn't have tripped any flags. This is your greed, Julian." Their perfect alliance was fracturing under the weight of a pressure they couldn't identify. They were trapped in a dark room with an unseen enemy, and they were starting to swing at each other. As they scrambled to deal with the regulators, David made his most terrifying discovery yet. Buried deep in an encrypted folder labeled Nightingale Phase 2, he found communications that went far beyond Julian and Chloe. They were negotiating with a ruthless competitor, a corporate vulture notorious for asset stripping. The plan wasn't just to steal Ethel from me. It was to have this competitor finance the takeover, and in return, Julian would help them dismantle the company, sell off its patents and divisions, and fire thousands of employees, all for a massive one-time payout. He wasn't trying to claim his own kingdom. He was planning to burn my entire empire to the ground for a bag of gold. The betrayal was deeper than I could have ever imagined. This was no longer about justice. This was about survival. That night, the cold mask of the strategist finally cracked. Alone in my study, surrounded by screens displaying flowcharts of their deceit, I found an old photograph from the company's launch party. The three of us, Julian, Chloe, and I, were huddled together, beaming, full of hope and cheap champagne. The woman in that photo, the trusting, optimistic Alara, stared back at me across 15 years of lies. A wave of profound grief washed over me, a sorrow for the people we were, for the dream we had shared. But as I looked from the photo to the evidence of their plan to destroy thousands of lives for profit, the grief receded, replaced by a diamond-hard resolve. The woman in that photo was dead, and I owed it to her memory to see this through to its brutal, necessary conclusion. My strategy shifted. Disruption and delay were no longer enough. I needed definitive, undeniable proof of their conspiracy, something that would not just expose them but annihilate them. I learned from David that Julian was scheduled to have a clandestine video conference with the head of the competitor firm. This was my chance. While Julian and Chloe were distracted with their legal troubles and infighting, David and I worked to gain access to Ethel's executive video conferencing server. We weren't just going to listen in. We were going to record everything. We were moving from sabotage to evidence gathering. I was no longer just laying traps. I was preparing the executioner's block and sharpening the axe for their public unveiling. The silent war had pushed them to the brink. Their timeline was in ruins. Their shell corporation was under federal scrutiny, and their trust in each other was evaporating. In the recordings from Julian's office, I heard their paranoia reach a fever pitch. They were convinced there was a mole, a traitor in their inner circle who was leaking information. They couldn't see the real threat, so they decided to invent one. "We need a distraction," Chloe said, her voice cold and pragmatic. "As someone we can pin this on if things go south. A scapegoat." Julian agreed instantly. "Someone loyal to her," he added. In that moment, I knew their next move before they did. They were going to go after someone I cared about. The game was about to get personal, and far more dangerous. My silent war had cornered them, and like all cornered animals, they were about to become vicious. The subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure before a storm were something I had learned to sense in business. It was the same inside my home. The air grew thick with a new kind of tension. Julian and Chloe's frustration over the regulatory delays and failing projections was curdling into something sharper, more dangerous: paranoia. Their hushed phone calls, which I monitored with clinical detachment, were no longer about strategy and timelines. They were filled with accusations and suspicion. They spoke of a leak, a traitor, convinced that someone from the inside was actively working against them. Their arrogance had prevented them from ever considering me as the source, so they began hunting for a phantom enemy within our own ranks, never realizing the ghost they were chasing was sitting right across the dinner table from them. I was listening to the live feed from Julian's office when the idea was born. It was Chloe's voice, stripped of all its feigned warmth, leaving only the cold, pragmatic steel beneath. "We're bleeding momentum, Julian," she said, her tone clipped and precise. "The delays are making our partners nervous. We need a diversion, a loud, messy one." There was a pause, and I could practically hear the gears turning in Julian's mind. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. Chloe's reply was instantaneous, the words delivered with the chilling finality of a death sentence. "We need a scapegoat, someone we can pin the ill leaks on. We'll fabricate a case for corporate espionage. It will refocus internal security, create a common enemy for the staff, and show our partners we're proactive about threats. It solves a dozen problems at once." My blood ran cold as I heard Julian's response. "Who?" he asked, not with hesitation, but with a hunter's curiosity. Chloe didn't miss a beat. "It has to be someone believable, someone with high-level access, who has been here forever, someone loyal to her." And then she said the name that made the carefully constructed ice around my heart crack. Marcus Thorne. Marcus, the head of our research and development division. The man who had been my first mentor when I joined the company as a junior strategist. The man who had walked me down the aisle when my own father couldn't. He was a pillar of integrity, a brilliant, gentle soul who saw Ethel not as a corporation, but as a family. He was the closest thing I had to a father, and they were about to burn him to the ground to create a smokescreen. For the first time since that night at the motel, the cold, calculating strategist in me was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage. This was no longer a corporate chess match. This was not about reclaiming a company or avenging a broken heart. They had crossed a line into a realm of depravity I hadn't thought even they were capable of. They were going to destroy an innocent man, a good man, for their own convenience. The game had changed. This was no longer about winning. This was about making sure they lost everything, that they were left with nothing but the ashes of the lives they had so casually decided to ruin. My silent war had just become a crusade, and my objective was no longer justice, it was utter annihilation. Through David's terrified, encrypted messages, I watched the fabrication begin. It was a masterclass in digital malevolence, orchestrated by Chloe with a lawyer's precision. They started by creating a ghost email account in Marcus's name, using it to send encrypted, but ultimately decipherable, data packets to a server owned by our biggest competitor. Then, They falsified server logs to show Marcus accessing sensitive financial projections at odd hours, carefully layering the digital forgeries over his actual, legitimate work patterns. They were not just planting evidence, they were weaving a completely new reality, a meticulous tapestry of lies designed to be utterly convincing to any external investigator. They were framing a man for a crime that had never even happened, committed by a traitor who didn't exist. My first instinct was to intervene, to have David go in and erase the fabricated evidence before it could take root. But it was a trap, and I knew it. Chloe was too smart for that. She would have created multiple redundant backups on isolated servers. She would have already flagged the suspicious activity with Ethel's head of security, a man fiercely loyal to Julian. If the evidence suddenly vanished, it wouldn't clear Marcus. It would only confirm their suspicions of a wider conspiracy and trigger a system-wide lockdown, cutting me off from my own investigation. For a terrifying moment, I felt utterly powerless, a spectator watching them build the gallows for my friend, knowing that any move I made to stop them would spring the trap on myself. This was their unexpected countermove, and it had me pinned. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. I saw it from the large glass window of my office, a scene that will be forever seared into my memory. Two members of corporate security, men Marcus had probably known for years, walked into his R&D lab. A few minutes later, they emerged, flanking him as they walked him towards the main exit. Marcus looked confused, then deeply hurt. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. He wasn't in handcuffs, but he might as well have been. He was being publicly shamed, paraded through the open-plan office like a common criminal. Employees stared, whispering amongst themselves. The poison was already spreading. In less than 24 hours, they had turned a company legend into a pariah. I stood motionless, my hand pressed against the cold glass, my fury a white-hot furnace inside my chest. An hour later, Julian convened an emergency meeting with the senior executive team. He stood at the head of the long, polished boardroom table, his face a mask of solemn, feigned regret. As some of you may have witnessed, he began, his voice grave. We had to take a difficult but necessary action today. A thorough internal investigation, led by our legal department, has uncovered a deeply disturbing case of corporate espionage. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the shock to ripple through the room. The evidence points unequivocally to Marcus Thorne. I had to sit there, silent, playing my part. I let my eyes widen in shock. I brought a hand to my mouth in disbelief, mirroring the reactions of those around me. Inside, I was a coiled serpent, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That evening, I staged the necessary confrontation. I found Julian in his study, pouring himself a scotch. I allowed my voice to tremble, my words to be laced with the distraught confusion they expected. Julian, what is this? What have you done? I asked, focusing entirely on the personal betrayal. Marcus, after everything he has done for this company, for us, how could you believe he would do something like this? He loves this company like it's his own child. I was banking on their perception of me as an emotional creature, incapable of seeing the larger strategic picture. I needed them to see a woman defending an old friend, not a COO questioning a flimsy corporate indictment. My performance had to be flawless. Julian swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer comfort or reassurance. He offered a cold, corporate platitude. Alara, this is beyond personal feelings, he said, his tone condescendingly patient, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. The evidence is overwhelming. Chloe's team did a remarkable job uncovering it. We have to protect the company from all threats, no matter where they come from. It's an unfortunate but necessary step to ensure our stability. He was dismissing my concern, and by extension, Marcus's entire life's work, as an emotional overreaction. He saw my loyalty to Marcus as another one of my weaknesses, a quaint sentimentality he had to manage. He had no idea it was about to become his undoing. The situation escalated faster than I could have imagined. Chloe, leveraging her position as head of legal, didn't just leave it as an internal matter. She packaged their fabricated evidence and handed it directly to federal authorities. It was a bold, vicious move designed to make the accusation irreversible. The news broke on a financial channel that evening. Ethel, head of R&D, Marcus Thorne, under federal investigation for corporate espionage. It was no longer about his job or his reputation. They were trying to put him in prison. They were willing to see a 65-year-old man, a titan of his industry, spend the rest of his life behind bars just to create a momentary distraction. The stakes of my silent war had just been raised from professional ruin to a man's freedom in life. A new, frantic urgency gripped me. My methodical, patient timeline for revenge was now obsolete. It was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every day that passed meant Marcus was one day closer to a federal indictment, his life savings draining away into a legal defense against a crime he didn't commit. The clock was ticking, not on their plan, but on his life. My mission had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just the avenger of my own betrayal. I had to become the champion of an innocent man. I had to pivot my entire strategy from slow-burning sabotage to a rapid, surgical strike designed to exonerate him completely. I arranged an immediate, high-risk meeting with David, not through our usual encrypted channels, but in person, at a noisy, anonymous coffee shop miles from the city center. The fear in his eyes was palpable. He was just an IT analyst, and he was now caught in the middle of a federal case. "They're monsters," he whispered, his hands trembling as he clutched a paper cup. "The digital trail they built, it's perfect. It will hold up in court." I looked him straight in the eye, my own fear locked away behind a wall of cold resolve. "Then we don't just disprove it," I said, my voice low and steady. "We prove it was a frame-up. We find the person who built it. We find Chloe's signature." Our hunt began anew, but this time it was different. We weren't searching for hidden financial accounts or ghost projects anymore. We were looking for the digital fingerprints of the forger. It was a far more dangerous game. We had to comb through Chloe's private legal servers, her encrypted work logs, the very digital sanctum where she had constructed her web of lies. Every query we ran, every file we accessed, carried the immense risk of tripping a security alert. David was sweating, his fingers flying across his keyboard, as we navigated the digital minefield she had created. We were no longer just observers. We were active intruders in the most secure part of the network. After 2 sleepless nights, David found it. It was a needle in a digital haystack, a detail so obscure only a systems architect would ever recognize it. In her haste and arrogance, Chloe had used a proprietary data synthesis program to create the forged evidence. It was a piece of software she herself had commissioned for the legal department 2 years ago, designed to compile and format evidence for discovery. And embedded in the metadata of every file it created was a single, encrypted line of code, a digital watermark, a unique signature that was traceable directly back to the software on her specific terminal. She had signed her own masterpiece of deceit. A wave of triumphant, icy relief washed over me. This was it. This was the smoking gun. It wasn't just evidence that could cast doubt on their case against Marcus. It was irrefutable proof that the evidence itself had been manufactured from within the legal department, from Chloe's own computer. We could prove the frame-up. We had the key to unlock Marcus's cage. The exhilaration was short-lived, however, replaced by the grim weight of my next task. I had the proof, but I couldn't use it yet. To reveal it now would be to show my hand. I had to wait for the perfect moment, and that meant Marcus had to continue to suffer. I forced myself to visit Marcus's wife, Eleanor, a woman I had known for 15 years. The visit was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. I sat in her living room, surrounded by pictures of a life built on trust and love, and listened to her speak through tears about her husband's devastation, about their dwindling retirement funds being funneled into legal fees. I held her hand and offered empty platitudes and hollow reassurances, all while the proof that could end her nightmare was sitting on an encrypted drive in my purse. The guilt was a physical weight, but it was also a crucible, burning away any last shred of hesitation. I would not just exonerate Marcus, I would make them pay for every tear Eleanor shed. Meanwhile, Julian's arrogance swelled to new heights. With Marcus, the last senior executive truly loyal to me, gone, he believed he had consolidated his power completely. He saw the espionage scandal as a masterstroke. In his mind, he had successfully purged the old guard, intimidated the rest of the staff, and demonstrated decisive leadership to their partners. His conversations with Chloe, which I continued to monitor, were filled with self-congratulation. "See, a necessary evil," he told her. "Now, no one will dare question our direction." His confidence was making him sloppy, his communications more brazen. He was a king who believed he had finally silenced all dissent, completely unaware that the executioner was already inside the castle walls. The upcoming video conference with the head of the competitor firm, the one financing their takeover, now took on a new, critical importance. It was their victory lap. I knew, with absolute certainty, that Julian's ego would compel him to boast about how he had handled the internal security threat. It was the perfect opportunity to catch their conspiracy and their frame-up in a single, undeniable trap. My objective was no longer just to record their financial plotting. It was to get them to confess, in their own words, to the destruction of Marcus Thorne. That recording would be the centerpiece of my revenge, the final nail in their coffins. The preparations for the digital ambush were all-consuming. David and I worked in a state of high-strung, caffeine-fueled intensity. He had to bypass the new security protocols Chloe had implemented after the leak, a system far more sophisticated than the previous one. He was building a digital ghost rig, a way to tap into the live video and audio feed from the executive server without creating a single data packet that could be traced back to us. It was a high-wire act with no safety net. One mistake, one tripped alarm, and our entire operation would be exposed. The fate of Marcus, and my own, rested on David's brilliance and my nerve. I found myself thinking about Marcus constantly, not as a victim, but as the man he was. I remembered his advice when Julian and I were first seeking funding. "Your strategy is the steel frame, Alara," he had told me, "but your integrity is the foundation. Don't ever compromise on the foundation." He had believed in me before anyone else, even before I fully believed in myself. They weren't just framing an employee. They were trying to desecrate a part of my own history, a part of my soul. My resolve hardened from steel into diamond. I was not just fighting for his future. I was defending our shared past and the very principles upon which we had built our dream. Their confidence was their greatest vulnerability. I listened as they celebrated their perceived victory. "He's completely isolated," Chloe said to Julian in a call, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "His own lawyers are probably telling him to take a plea deal. By the time this goes to court, we'll be in full control, and the company will stand behind us." Julian laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "He should have retired gracefully," he said. "He chose the wrong side." They were so convinced of their own brilliance, so blinded by their success in framing Marcus, that they had stopped looking over their shoulders. They were striding confidently towards the edge of a cliff they couldn't see. The moment of near failure came just 12 hours before the scheduled conference. A silent alarm, a new heuristic protocol Chloe had installed, flagged David's initial breach. It didn't identify him, but it locked down the server port he was planning to use. A cold dread washed over me as he messaged me. "I'm locked out. They know someone was probing. I can't get back in without setting off every alarm in the system." For a few terrifying hours, it seemed our plan was in ruins. The one chance to get the confession we needed was about to slip through our fingers. The walls were closing in, and my carefully laid plans were threatening to collapse. But a cornered strategist is a dangerous one. I refused to accept defeat. "There has to be another way," I messaged David. "Think outside the box. An exploit. A vulnerability. Anything." Forced to improvise under immense pressure, David devised a new plan, a wildly audacious and incredibly risky one. He would use a zero-day exploit in the public-facing video conferencing software itself, routing the recording signal out through a chain of proxy servers in 3 different countries for a fraction of a second before capturing it on our secure drive. If their security team was monitoring outgoing traffic with sufficient scrutiny, we could be traced. I had to make a choice. Retreat and let Marcus face his fate, or risk everything on a single, desperate gamble. "Do it," I commanded. On the day of the conference, my entire house felt like a pressure cooker. I had confined myself to my study, feigning a severe migraine to ensure I would be left alone. On a small, encrypted tablet hidden beneath a stack of architectural drawings, I watched a simple status screen. It showed a single line of code, a silent confirmation that David was in position. There was no video feed for me, no audio, just a blinking cursor that represented our connection to the server. I sat in the silent room, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white, and waited. Every tick of the clock was a hammer blow against my nerves. The meeting began. David sent a single, encrypted character to my tablet. A for active. They were connected. Julian, Chloe, and the vulture capitalist who was funding their treason were now in a virtual room together. And we were the silent, invisible fourth party. I imagined the scene. Julian, exuding charm and confidence. Chloe, sharp and attentive, both of them completely oblivious that their every word was being captured. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I pleaded with the universe, with whatever forces of justice still existed, for Julian to be his arrogant self. Just this once, I needed his ego to be his undoing. And then, David sent me a transcript snippet. It came in a burst of text. Competitor, CEO. And what about internal stability? I heard a rumor about some trouble with your R&D head. My breath caught in my throat. This was the moment. I waited, my eyes glued to the screen, for the next block of text. Julian's reply appeared, and I could practically hear the smugness in his tone. Julian. We had a small loyalty issue. A relic from the old regime who couldn't adapt to the new vision. But our legal team handled it beautifully. Very clean. Took him right off the board and sent a clear message to the rest. Chloe couldn't resist adding her own contribution. Her words appeared next, dripping with cold, clinical pride. Chloe. He was a liability, tied to an outdated way of doing things. The evidence we compiled was extremely convincing. He won't be a problem for us or anyone else for a very long time. They laughed. The transcript confirmed it, a shared, casual laugh between 3 predators who had just finished discussing the destruction of a good man's life as if it were a minor business transaction. They had just confessed, on a fully recorded, legally admissible line. They had handed me the sword. A single word appeared on my screen from David. Secured. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for hours. It was a ragged, shaky exhale of relief, tension, and cold, hard triumph. We had it. We had the financial conspiracy. We had the digital proof of the frame-up. And now, we had their own voices, their own words, confessing to it all. The weight of Marcus's fate lifted from my shoulders, replaced by the chilling, exhilarating certainty of my final move. The time for defense was over. The time for exoneration was past. Now, it was time for execution. My strategy, which had been forced onto the defensive, now snapped back into a ferocious offensive. The pieces were all in place, not just to reclaim my company, but to utterly dismantle their lives, to expose them so completely that there would be no recovery, no second act, no quiet retirement funded by their ill-gotten gains. Their desperate escalation, their attack on Marcus, had been their fatal mistake. They thought they were showing strength, but they had only revealed the true depths of their depravity, and in doing so, had given me the moral justification for what I was about to do. A few days later, an engraved invitation arrived. It was for the Ethel Innovators Gala, the company's most prestigious annual event. It was 2 weeks away. Julian had already told me he would be giving the keynote address, announcing a bold new vision for the company, the public unveiling of his stolen kingdom. The stage was already set. The media would be there. The investors, the board members. Our entire industry would be watching. It was the perfect venue, not a quiet boardroom deposition or a sterile courtroom hearing. I would give them the public spectacle they so desperately craved. I contacted David one last time. My instructions were simple. He was to take all the evidence, the siphoned bank records, Chloe's incriminating digital watermark, the emails, the text messages, and the crown jewel, their recorded confession, and weave it into a seamless, devastating presentation. It had to be simple enough for a layman to understand, yet powerful enough to destroy 2 careers and trigger a federal investigation in the span of 5 minutes. He was no longer my IT analyst. He was the producer of my grand finale. Their attack on Marcus had changed me. The cold strategist had been forced to fight a battle she hadn't chosen, for a life that wasn't her own. In their desperation, they had made me their judge, jury, and executioner. Any lingering thoughts of a quiet victory, of a simple reclamation, were gone. They had shown me they had no mercy, and in doing so, they had forfeited any right to receive it from me. They had wanted to burn an innocent man, and now I was going to burn their entire world down around them, using the very fire they had ignited. I placed the invitation to the gala on my desk. They expected me to be there, of course. I would be the perfect prop, the loyal, supportive wife, still emotionally fragile, standing by her brilliant husband as he stepped into his new, undisputed role as visionary leader. They had no idea that I wasn't coming as a guest. I wasn't coming as a victim or a survivor. I was coming as the architect of their ruin, to watch the beautiful, flawless illusion they had built for themselves come crashing down in a symphony of their own lies. The stage was set, the script was written, and the final act was about to begin. The night of the Ethel Innovators Gala arrived, a symphony of glittering gowns, clinking champagne glasses, and manufactured smiles. From my command center, the quiet, darkened study of the home he thought I was still grieving in, I watched it all on a multi-screen display. I saw Julian, resplendent in a custom tuxedo, moving through the crowd like a conquering hero, accepting accolades for a victory he hadn't yet won. He was the picture of confidence, the visionary CEO on the cusp of his greatest triumph. Chloe stood by his side, a sleek, smiling python in couture, her eyes scanning the room with proprietary arrogance. They believed I was at home, a fragile casualty of their war, too broken to even attend. They had no idea I was the one directing the entire production. My finger poised over the digital detonator that would turn their coronation into a public execution. The stage was theirs, but the show was all mine. Julian ascended the stage to thunderous applause, the massive screen behind him displaying the gleaming Ethel logo. He beamed, soaking in the adoration, and began his speech. His voice, smooth and practiced, filled the grand ballroom, speaking of bold new futures, unwavering integrity, and the painful but necessary changes required for progress. The dramatic irony was so thick I could taste it. He was unknowingly delivering the prologue to his own demise. On my main monitor, David's final confirmation blinked. System primed. Awaiting your command. I took a slow, steadying breath, my heart a cold, heavy metronome in my chest. I let Julian get to the crescendo of his opening remarks, the point where he would unveil the name of his new initiative, the public face of the Nightingale Protocol. I let him have that one last moment of triumph before I took everything. With a single keystroke, I gave the command. On the stage in the grand ballroom, the Ethel logo behind Julian flickered, stuttered, and then dissolved. The audience murmured, assuming a technical glitch. But what replaced it was no presentation graphic. It was the cold, hard reality of a bank statement from Viridian Holdings, the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. An animated line traced the flow of money, hundreds of microtransactions siphoned from Ethel's own departmental budgets, coalescing into a multi-million-dollar war chest. And at the bottom of each authorization, a digital signature, irrefutable and stark against the white background. Chloe Sterling, head of legal. The murmurs in the room died, replaced by a stunned, absolute silence. Julian faltered mid-sentence, his eyes darting to the screen in confusion. A confusion that was rapidly turning to ice-cold dread. The trap had been sprung. The screen shifted, and the corporate crime became a portrait of personal cruelty. A series of emails and encrypted text messages flashed in succession, their words stark and damning. "She's an emotional wreck, completely distracted," read one of Julian's messages to Chloe. "Just need to manage her for a few more weeks until the protocol is complete," Chloe's reply. "Her loyalty is a liability we can't afford. Keep her comfortable and clueless." The audience was no longer just seeing a financial crime. They were witnessing the meticulous, cold-blooded dissection of a 15-year friendship and marriage. They were seeing the two of them not as lovers, but as co-conspirators. And I was not a scorned wife, but a target to be neutralized. I watched Chloe's face in the front row, her practiced smile frozen into a ghastly, horrified mask as her own words were broadcast for the world to see. Then came the centerpiece, the audio file. The screen went black, and their voices filled the cavernous hall, captured with perfect clarity from the bug in Julian's office. First, Julian's voice, discussing the need to frame Marcus Thorne. Then Chloe's, clinically suggesting he fit the profile perfectly. And then, the sound that sealed their fates, their shared uncasual laughter as they discussed destroying the life of an innocent man. Audible gasps rippled through the audience. This was no longer a corporate scandal. It was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. On stage, Julian was paralyzed, his face ashen, his mouth slightly agape. He was a king standing naked before his court, stripped of his charm, his lies, his power. He was finally seen for what he was, a petty, cruel man who would burn anything and anyone to feel important. For the final, devastating blow, the screen split into two live feeds. On the left, a tight, unflattering close-up of Julian's horrified, sweat-slicked face. On the right, a live video from Ethel headquarters. The feed showed federal agents walking into Marcus Thorne's office, but they weren't there to arrest him. I watched as the lead agent shook Marcus's hand and presented him with an official letter of exoneration, the evidence I had anonymously delivered to their office an hour before. The camera zoomed in on Marcus's face as he read the letter, his expression of confusion melting into stunned, tearful relief. I had not just proven their guilt. I had broadcast his innocence to the entire world in real time. It was not just punishment. It was reclamation. It was justice. Delivered live and in high definition. The ballroom erupted into chaos. The stunned silence shattered into a cacophony of shouting reporters, camera flashes firing like strobe lights, and the panicked clamor of investors and board members rising from their seats. Julian remained frozen on the stage, a deer caught in the blinding headlights of his own ruin. Security guards began to move toward the stage, though it wasn't clear if they were there to protect him or detain him. I saw Chloe try to slip away into the crowd, but she was immediately swarmed by journalists, their microphones and cameras creating an impromptu cage from which there was no escape. They had craved the spotlight, had plotted and betrayed and destroyed for their moment at the center of the world. Now they had it, and it was burning them alive. From the quiet solitude of my study, I watched the beautiful, glorious pandemonium for another 30 seconds. I saw the first police officers arrive at the ballroom entrance. I saw Julian finally collapse onto the stage, a puppet with his strings cut. Then, with a calm, deliberate click of the mouse, I closed the connection. I didn't cheer. I didn't weep. I felt a profound, glacial calm settle over me. The war was over. The fortress of their lies had been razed to the ground, and the foundation was now clear for me to rebuild upon. They had chosen the grandest stage imaginable to announce their reign, and I had simply obliged them, turning their coronation into a public beheading. The Nightingale Protocol was complete, but it was my protocol, and it had sung a song of absolute, irrefutable truth. My own reign was just beginning. ¿Te está gustando esta historia? Deja un like y suscríbete al canal. Ahora continuamos con el video. The chaos in the ballroom was a distant, muted roar on my monitors. I watched as Julian, a man once defined by his impeccable control, was led away in handcuffs, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief. Chloe, stripped of her composure, looked like a cornered animal, flinching from the barrage of camera flashes as she was escorted out by federal agents. They had wanted to be the center of the world, and for one night, they were, the stars of a primetime tragedy they had written themselves. I didn't feel the fiery heat of victory or the bitter satisfaction of revenge. Instead, a profound and absolute silence settled in my soul. The storm had passed, the noise had faded, and in the quiet aftermath, all that remained was the vast open landscape of my future. The war was over, won not on a battlefield of emotion, but in the cold, silent theater of logic and data. My work was done. My life was just beginning. The legal fallout was less a battle and more a controlled demolition. The evidence I had compiled was so comprehensive, so irrefutably damning, that it left no room for legal maneuvering. Julian and Chloe were denied bail, deemed extreme flight risks. Their personal and offshore assets, including the funds in Viridian Holdings, were immediately frozen by federal order. The media portrayed it as a swift and stunning fall from grace. But I knew the truth. It was a meticulously engineered descent. They had built their gilded cage of lies over 15 years, and I had simply presented the world with the key. Their lawyers advised them to plead guilty, but their egos, even in ruin, were too large. They chose to fight, and in doing so, only prolonged their public humiliation, ensuring every sordid detail of their conspiracy was laid bare for the world to see. 3 days after the gala, the Ethel board convened an emergency session. The company was in freefall, our stock price plummeting amidst the scandal. They were terrified. I didn't attend the meeting in person. Instead, I joined via a secure video link, a deliberate power move. I presented them not with an emotional plea, but with a cold, hard, 100-day stabilization plan I had prepared weeks in advance. It was detailed, aggressive, and brilliant. It outlined how to handle the media, reassure investors, and restructure leadership. Faced with the choice between total collapse and the architect who had just surgically removed the company's cancer, their decision was a foregone conclusion. By unanimous vote, they terminated Julian and Chloe and named me President and Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. My name was no longer just on the blueprints, it was on the letterhead. My first act as CEO wasn't to move into Julian's office or issue a press release. It was to walk down to the R&D division. I found Marcus Thorne surrounded by his cheering team, his face still etched with the weary relief of a man pulled back from the abyss. In front of everyone, I shook his hand. "Marcus," I said, my voice clear and steady, "your suspension is officially expunged from all company records. Furthermore, I am promoting you to the newly created position of Chief Innovation Officer with a permanent seat on the board of directors. Ethel was built on your integrity and brilliance, and from now on, that is what will guide us." The applause was deafening. It was more than a reinstatement. It was a public declaration of our new values. Loyalty would be rewarded, and integrity would be our foundation, forged in the fires of betrayal. The next day, I held my first all-hands meeting. I stood before the thousands of employees whose livelihoods Julian had been willing to sacrifice. I didn't speak of my personal pain. I spoke of our collective future. "The last few weeks have been built on a foundation of lies," I told them. "That era is over. Our new foundation will be transparency, accountability, and a relentless pursuit of the excellence that has always been the true heart of this company. The rot has been cut out. Now, we rebuild, stronger, smarter, and together." There was no soaring rhetoric, just the quiet, unshakable confidence of a leader who had seen the worst and had not only survived, but conquered. I could see the fear in their eyes being replaced by a flicker of hope, and then, by a renewed sense of purpose. My final move against the conspirators targeted the vulture capitalist who had financed their scheme. His company's stock was now tanking due to his association with the Ethel scandal. He publicly denied any knowledge of the frame-up, but I had the recording of him laughing along with Julian and Chloe. I didn't leak it. Instead, my new legal team paid him a visit. We didn't threaten a lawsuit. We made him an offer. Using Ethel's newly secured line of credit, I initiated a hostile takeover of his now vulnerable company. It was a brutal, elegant checkmate. He was forced to sell his own empire to me for pennies on the dollar to avoid federal prosecution. I didn't just defeat my enemies. I absorbed their assets, turning their weapon against them and expanding my own kingdom in the process. Julian and Chloe's trial was a pathetic spectacle. Stripped of their wealth and power, they turned on each other with a viciousness that shocked even the most jaded court reporters. Their defense was a tangled mess of accusations, each trying to paint the other as the true mastermind. But the evidence, the bank records, the digital watermark, their own recorded voices, was absolute. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts in under 2 hours. The judge handed down the maximum sentence: 20 years in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. The final news images of them, traded their designer clothes for orange jumpsuits, were a grim but satisfying epitaph to their ambition. They had tried to erase me, and instead, they had been erased from the world. A month later, I visited Marcus in the newly christened Marcus Thorne Innovation Center. The wing had previously borne Julian's name. We stood before a window overlooking the campus, the heart of the empire we had both fought to save. He tried to thank me again, but I stopped him. You were the one person they couldn't corrupt. Marcus, I said, when they came for you, they showed me this wasn't just about business. It was about right and wrong. You were my moral compass. You saved me from becoming as cold as they were. In that quiet moment, I felt the last vestiges of the vengeful strategist recede, replaced by the leader I was always meant to be, one who understood that true power wasn't about control, but about purpose. The process of rebuilding included a systematic cleansing. I had every trace of Julian and Chloe scrubbed from Ethel's corporate history. Their portraits were removed from the boardroom, their names taken off plaques, their self-congratulatory press releases deleted from our archives. This wasn't an act of petty revenge. It was a corporate exorcism. I was ensuring that the future of Ethel would be defined by its genuine innovators and builders, not by the charlatans who had temporarily occupied the throne. I was reclaiming our narrative, making it clear to everyone, internally and externally, that the age of the illusion was over. The truth was now our most valuable asset. My personal transformation was as profound as my professional one. As the company's stock not only recovered but soared to unprecedented heights under my leadership, my personal wealth grew exponentially. I was no longer just a wealthy woman. I was a financial powerhouse. But the money felt different now. It wasn't a scorecard. It was a tool. I used the billions seized from Julian's and the competitors' assets to establish the Ethel Foundation for Ethical Innovation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding sustainable technology startups that prioritized integrity over profit. I was taking the spoils of their greed and using them to build a better world, a final, lasting monument to their failure. I often found myself standing in the vast CEO office, looking out at the city skyline that Julian had so desperately wanted to own. The view was the same, but my perspective had irrevocably changed. I felt no giddy triumph, no arrogant sense of victory. I felt a quiet, unshakable sense of self. The naive, trusting woman who had believed in a perfect illusion was gone forever. The cold, calculating avenger who had waged a silent war had also served her purpose and receded. In their place stood someone new, a woman forged in the crucible of betrayal, who had integrated her strategic mind with a core of diamond-hard resilience. I had not just survived, I had been reborn. One evening, I turned away from the window, the city lights painting patterns on the floor. My desk was not empty, a symbol of a finished war, but covered in blueprints for Ethel's most ambitious project yet, a self-sustaining city prototype. My phone rang, the display showing the name of my new lead architect, a brilliant young woman I had personally promoted. I picked up the receiver, my voice calm, steady, and filled with the quiet energy of creation. "Ilara Vance," I said, a small smile touching my lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Tell me you have good news. Let's build the future. My reign hadn't ended with their destruction. It was just beginning. Final CTA. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed watching this story of justice and rebirth, be sure to check out the other videos on our channel. We have a new story for you every day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'll see you in the next video.